Was he a premature baby or proof that the English crown was born with a secret under its pillow? That is the question that has haunted history for more than 500 years and continues to divide experts, amateurs, and even novelists who have turned this mystery into a feast of speculation. Everything revolves around a birth that occurred on September 19th, 1486, when Prince Arthur Tudor came into the world just 8 months after his parents, Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, were married. A difference of weeks that, on the surface, might seem like an unimportant detail, but in Tudor politics could mean the beginning of a dynasty under the shadow of suspicion or the glorious consolidation of a lineage. For what if the future heir to the throne had been conceived before his parents officially joined hands before God and the Church? Could that jeopardize his legitimacy? Or on the contrary, was it simply an early birth that, against all odds, resulted in a strong and healthy child? Henry VII and Elizabeth of York were married on January 18, 1486, an event celebrated as the union of two rival houses that had stained England with blood in the so-called Wars of the Roses. The White Rose of York and the Red Rose of Lancaster were fused in this union that was supposed to bring peace and stability. However, several obstacles had to be overcome to achieve this marriage. Elizabeth had been declared illegitimate by her own uncle, Richard III, forcing Henry to maneuver with his newly elected parliament to have that stain removed. Furthermore, as distant cousins, they needed papal dispensation to marry legally. The document did not arrive until March, but a papal legate in England had already given the green light in January, so the ceremony took place without further delay. It was urgent that the union be formalized, and not just for political reasons, because just a few months later, Elizabeth was already in Winchester, a place steeped in symbolism due to its association with the legendary King Arthur. There, she would give birth to the heir, and the chosen name left no room for doubt: Arthur, after the mythical monarch who was meant to embody the hope of a united and glorious kingdom. But the timing didn't quite align. The baby was born just 35 weeks after the wedding, and then the question arose, was this a child conceived in the marital bed or long before? Those who defend the idea that Arthur was a full-term baby rely on the strength with which he was presented to the world. There was no emergency baptism, as was done when a child was born weak and at risk of dying. On the contrary, his baptism was a grand public ceremony in the majestic Winchester Cathedral. This was not organized for a fragile newborn, but for one who was healthy enough to be displayed before nobles and clergy. Furthermore, Elizabeth did not become pregnant again immediately afterward, as was customary when an heir was born prematurely and there was a risk of death. Her next daughter, Margaret, was born in 1489, indicating that there was no rush to replace the little prince. Everything seemed to indicate that Arthur was doing well, that he had arrived at a good weight and was not a weak baby, which raises doubts about his prematurity. On the other hand, there are those who maintain that Arthur was born prematurely. Historian David Starkey, for example, bases his argument on the fact that Elizabeth had arrived in Winchester only 3 weeks before the birth. If she was truly expecting a son at that time, she would have left much earlier. Some suggest that the eventful journey may have led to an early birth. Others believe that the late arrival of important godparents at the christening indicates that the birth came as a surprise to everyone. Yet none of this is definitive proof. Contemporary accounts are curiously silent. Contemporary chronicles, celebratory poems, and family records all mention the birth with joy, but none speak of a premature birth or a weak child. Bernard André, Prince Arthur's own tutor, wrote years later that Elizabeth had conceived a few days after the wedding, a seemingly innocent phrase that, however, opens the door to two interpretations. Either it confirmed that the child was born prematurely, or it softened the reality that the pregnancy already existed before the marriage. Silence can be as revealing as words. In the 15th century, a premature birth could be a sign of miracle or misfortune, but no official account speaks of Arthur as a prodigious baby who survived against the odds. Had he been born weak, it would have been perfect for presenting the Tudor dynasty as blessed by God. But no, that narrative wasn't used. Why? Perhaps because there was nothing miraculous to report, simply because Arthur was a healthy child from the start. Now, let's suppose that Henry and Elizabeth had consummated their relationship before the formal wedding. Would that be a scandal? In the medieval mindset, perhaps not so much. A marriage could, in practice, be considered valid if there was consent and consummation, even without an immediate public ceremony. It could be that the two, engaged for years, simply decided to begin their life together before the papal papers arrived. For them, they were already de facto married. Politically, a public wedding was indispensable, but intimately, they could consider themselves united. Thus, Arthur would have been conceived within what for them was already a marriage. Like and share this video with anyone you think needs to know this fact. This detail changes the perspective, because even if he was conceived before January 1486, Arthur was still legitimate in the logic of the time, and contemporaries, rather than get entangled in the mathematics of conception, preferred to remain silent and accept that the heir had been born within a marriage recognized by the Church. Centuries later, Francis Bacon would write that Arthur had been born at 8 months old. It was 1621, and Bacon was in disgrace, hastily writing a biography of Henry VII. Without citing sources, he claimed that the prince had been 8 months old, although strong and healthy, a detail that later chroniclers would repeat until it became embedded in the collective memory as if it were absolute truth. But where did he get it from? Nobody knows. Perhaps he deduced it by seeing the dates. Perhaps he read a lost manuscript. Perhaps he simply invented an elegant explanation so as not to tarnish the royal couple's reputation, because it was less damaging to say that a child was born premature than to insinuate that its parents had slept together before they were married. This is where the political dimension comes in. The prestige of the Tudor dynasty couldn't have begun with rumors of an out-of-wedlock pregnancy. Saying that Arthur was born 8 months old, but strong and healthy, was a face-saving solution. The public accepted the medical explanation, even though doctors of the time believed that those born at 8 months old had little chance of survival. It was preferable to sustain this paradox rather than admit to an early love affair. But would it really have mattered? When Anne Boleyn later became pregnant before marrying Henry VIII, her daughter Elizabeth was initially recognized as legitimate. What invalidated her status wasn't her having been conceived earlier, but the fact that her parents' marriage was annulled. In Arthur's case, there was no doubt. He was born into a valid and recognized marriage. That was enough to secure his right to the throne. The irony of this whole story is that Arthur, the child born amid suspicion, never reigned. He died young at 15 after marrying Catherine of Aragon, leaving the door open for his younger brother, Henry VIII, to ascend the throne. And it was that same Henry who years later unleashed a religious uproar in Europe, seeking to justify his marriage to Catherine as invalid because she had previously been his brother's wife. A bitter irony, because while Arthur's legitimacy at birth was being debated, what really changed history was his premature death. Thanks for joining us this far. Subscribe and tap the bell so you don't miss our next videos.